You know, page 188 is the introductory statement to almost the rest of this chapter. And it says that another source of difficulties or differences of interpretation and application of New Testament teaching is found in the failure to understand the nature of Jesus' teaching. Now, last week, we started on the top of page 193 discussing the law of Moses and how many people, so many religious people still have no idea that there are two completely separate covenants and that one of those covenants has been nullified by the other, that there can't be two ongoing covenants, at least not in the nature of the Old and the New Testament. And we also noted we talked at length about the nature of the Old Testament in all of its specific prescriptions. In other words, God, knowing that the Jewish people were stubborn and stiff-necked people because they were His people by birth and not by choice, that there was no transformative change that would take place in the mind or the heart of a Jew that would make him God's child. So then God set forth, as we noted, 613 thou shalt and thou shalt nots. And then, of course, many of those were prescriptive in nature so far as the punishment that was to be received. In other words, there was no arguing about the punishment that was to be received by those that violated those laws. Also, one thing I did not mention, and this is another thing that people fail to recognize, is that the law of Moses was not just a moral law. It was also a civil law. In other words, it governed them religiously, but it also governed their everyday affairs and their dealings with one another. And so that makes it extremely different from the law of Christ. One thing that always bothers me, and it's just basically due to prejudice and ignorance, is that whenever people that are religiously minded, I mean in the sense of New Testament Christianity, when people that are religiously minded involve themselves in the political process, then the leftists and the atheists and other infidels all start hollering that Christians are trying to create a theocracy. In other words, we think that we're going to let the church run the government. Now, I wouldn't deny for a minute that there are a lot of people that'd be agreeable to that. I'm not one of them, because the New Testament is not given in any sense to govern the nations of men. It is not a document. It is not a document that is given for governments to use to figure out how to conduct their business. The New Testament is given to change the hearts and minds of the individual men, and thereby change the way that they change the way they act individually, and thus collectively. But it has nothing to do with overseeing the government. And so that's a problem that people have on both sides. That some would love to have a theocracy so long as they were in charge and they got to make the rules. But there's also those that don't understand the very nature of New Testament Christianity. And I did mention this last week, that New Testament Christianity is not a threat to any governmental system. It is not a threat. Christianity was not a threat to the Roman government. Now, they perceived it as a threat because they didn't understand the nature of the kingship of Jesus or the lordship of Jesus. And then when the Caesars decided they wanted to be gods and worship, then Christianity and Roman government came into conflict. But only when a man claims to be God will Christianity come into conflict with God. Christianity is not inconsistent with communism. At least at the very essence of communism. I don't mean communism that punishes religious people. I mean, and by the way, communism is like socialism. It's a miserable failure. It fails every time it's been attempted, and usually a lot of people end up dead, usually by the tens of millions. But, the idea behind communism is to make everybody equal through government means, in essence. That's the what?
I think we should vote if we know a Christian's running and an atheist running, we need to vote for that Christian.
Maybe. Maybe not. I mean, what do you mean by Christian? You mean somebody that professes to be religious? Or do you mean somebody that is a New Testament Christian? Because you're not going to find many New Testament Christians on the ballot. So my question is, are you going to vote for somebody that professes to be a Christian? Or are you going to vote for somebody else?
Well, I'm going to vote.
All right, now I'm fixing to put your feet to the fire, Furman. You ready? You got your shoes on?
No, I don't want to.
You better put them both on. You and I both voted for Donald Trump, right?
Yep.
The least godly man of all of the Republican candidates. Without question. He was the least godliest man of all the 17 Republican... Hold on a second, Walter. The least godliest man of all 17 Republican candidates. Married 3 times, cheated on every wife that he's ever had, cheated on the wife he's got now. I mean, just a generally despicable human being. But of all of them, he's probably made the best president. He's probably made the best president. Why? Well, number one, he's the only one that had the backbone to appoint people to the Supreme Court that were hardcore constitutionalists, or at least so really constitutionalists in the true sense of the word. First Bush blew it, second Bush blew it. They were both supposedly God-fearing men, and their appointees were disasters. Trump appointed Gorsuch, appointed Kavanaugh, and he's probably fixing to appoint Amy Barrett when everybody figures out that Ruth Ginsburg's been dead for about 6 months. All right, so far as holding our country in a constitutional sense that allows for the freedom of religion, Trump's probably been the best president, but he's the least godly of all of them. Now, he'll get up and talk about God, and he'll talk about the Bible, and he'll go out and have his big rallies, and he'll play to the bass, and and he'll talk the language, but he ain't no more religious man than a man on the moon.
What you saying, this don't go vote?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that the measuring stick that you set up has some serious flaws in it.
Well,
I mean, look, Ben Carson is probably the most godly man of all of them that ran. I mean, that's just based on what I can see. I'd say Ben Carson was probably the most godly man that there was. All right? But he's probably the least qualified of all of them. He had no ability to grasp various concepts of foreign diplomacy and things that are going on in the Middle East. I mean, that's not a knock on him. I mean, my goodness, he's a brain surgeon. It's not like he's a dummy, But there were certain nuances of leadership that he didn't understand that would have made him a very ineffectual leader. Jimmy Carter was probably as religious man as ever served in the presidency in the last 100 years. He was a horrible president. And so what I'm saying, Firm, is I understand what you're saying. And yeah, if we could get good, godly men to run that are competent. There are a whole lot of good, godly men that I don't want to be president. Does that make sense? There's a lot of good, godly men I wouldn't want to be president because I don't think they have the competence to be president. And so I'm not picking on you, Firm. I'm just saying I understand what you're saying, but you and I both voted for Trump, and we'll probably vote for him again in 2020.
Probably vote for Republicans.
Well, yeah, right. But we,
We don't close it, what her name.
Right. So the point is, the point is, good godly men can be in government, and I think that'd be great. But you want the person who's going to defend the Constitution and promote constitutional governance. And I'm not saying that Trump's perfect in that respect by any regard. I don't think any of them have ever read the 10th Amendment. But anyway, that's another argument for another time. And probably only me and Scott knows what that means. But the idea of the old covenant and the new covenant, that the new covenant is not given as a law to govern the governments of men. It's a law given to govern the hearts of men. Now, if a man will follow the dictates of the New Testament, then that'll show in whatever he does, whether it be politics or a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is. You know, I know Hunt has to cringe because, you know, there are a lot of jokes about lawyers. You know, and maybe rightfully so. Maybe rightfully so. You know, and people generally don't hold lawyers in very high esteem until they need one. You know, and then they want one, or you know, then they think a lot of them. But you know, but I consider Scott. He's about as good a guy as I know. But he's a lawyer. You know, but him being a lawyer doesn't have any effect on the kind of person that he is. But you know, but if I was going, if I was going to pick a lawyer, I'd want one like Scott. But you know, there may be areas of competence that Scott doesn't have. And I might not need Scott to be a lawyer. And would I be wrong to find a different lawyer if Scott wasn't particularly competent? By the way, you understand what I mean by competent, right? I mean, there's a million different ways to practice law, and nobody can be perfect at all of them. All right? And so I wouldn't be wrong if I went somewhere else. I didn't pick Scott because I have a goal in mind. All right, so anyway, now, looking at the bottom of page 193, it says, this is, we mentioned this last week, another special need for its, talking about the old law of Moses, for its exactness in statement was occasioned by the fact that punishment was the principal motivating force, and this was to be administered by man himself. On the other hand, the law of Christ is to all men who will believe it and who in love accept it. And each individual who is to interpret and apply this teaching in his life has accepted it voluntarily, being led to do so by the goodness of God and having no right whatsoever to administer punishment to others because of their failure to live in keeping with the teaching. That's why I said Christianity is not incompatible with any system of government. Christians primarily are concerned with Christianity. Politics, needs to be way down the list in the concerns of the life of the Christian. Yeah. Christianity can be practiced in communism, provided that the people in charge are not anti-God. Christianity can be practiced in a socialist. Christianity can be practiced in a dictatorship or a monarchy or a representative republic or whatever type of government that there is. That's the beauty of the way God organized the church. I mean, the church itself is separates itself from the state. It separates itself from the state. Many of the problems that we have had over the last 1,700 years came because the church joined itself to the government. When Constantine declared Christianity basically as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the early 300s, well, what happened to the church then? It became directly tied, joined at the hip with the government, and became an arm of the government. Well, then later the church became powerful, and then the government became an arm of the church. All the kings of Europe, through the Middle Ages, they all had their allegiances to the church. The church, Catholicism, gathered up armies, waged wars, massacred people by the tens of thousands, held inquisitions. I mean, they killed all opposition. That's why we don't want the church to have any part of the government, and we don't want the government to have any part of the church. All right? And so the nature of the church is that we handle our own business. That's what it's all about. That's what he's saying here. The church handles its business. We don't punish people for not obeying the gospel. We're not authorized to do that. God will handle that. That's all in the purview of God. God will punish those who do not obey the gospel. We just preach the gospel and practice the gospel and then try to convince others to obey the gospel. But we are not at liberty to punish those who do not practice Christianity. Among the Jews, a Jew that didn't practice Judaism, what happened to him? They killed him. He's either outcast or he was executed. And so the difference between these laws is man, it's huge. I mean, and people just, it bothers me that people can't see it. Now, what Stroop is going to start pursuing here on the bottom of 193 through 194, 5, 6, and 7 is this. That the law of Christ is different, and I mentioned this just briefly at the end last week, that the law of Christ is different from the law of Moses in that, as a general rule, it commands generally and not specifically. It commands generally and not specifically. All right? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. Now that's part of the old law, but Jesus repeated it, and I think it still works, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Love one another as I have loved you. Pursue peace with all men and holiness, without which no man shall see God. Those are very, we might think of them as being very specific, but in fact they're very general, aren't they? How do I pursue peace with all men? Well, I consider others as being better than myself. Well, how do you do that? Well, the Bible doesn't express how you do that. It leaves it up to the dictates of your heart and conscience and how dedicated you are to the teaching and the life of Christ to put those things into practice as best you know how and fulfill the will of God. Does that make sense? Jesus doesn't expressly tell you how to love one another as I love you. In other words, now, and this is how you do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But he leaves it up to our conscience. Nothing was left, very little was left to the conscience under the old law. And so that's where Stroop is going with this. And he talks about that the Jews got caught up in serving according to the letter of the law, and in so doing they forgot all about the spirit of the law. In other words, they didn't allow for anybody to have a matter of conscience. They didn't allow for any type of expediency. Of course, then we talked about we talked about our law, and then all the little hedges. So if you don't break, if you don't cross this line, you'll surely not cross this one. If you don't cross this line, and they built all these hedges around the law to keep you from breaking the law, and the hedges themselves became the law. But Jesus didn't teach us or instruct us in that way. And then in page 194, all the way through 194, you have a series of contrasts, and this will sound or should sound familiar. You have heard it has been said, but I say. For example, you've heard that it's been said to those of old time, you shall not commit murder, and whoever murders shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you, whosoever is angry with his brother without cause will be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council, and whoever says, thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. You've heard it's been said of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, that whoever looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. See how the whole thing has changed? The law of Moses was predicated upon what you actually did, but Jesus' law is predicated on how you think. Because Jesus knows that how we think will ultimately manifest itself in what we say and what we do. That's Matthew 15. What comes out of a man is what defiles him. And he listed murders and adulteries among those things. It wasn't just about what came out of his heart and came out of his mouth, like, lying and those types of things. But Jesus said, it was teaching us that if our heart is not pure, then you can't have an impure heart and hide that from the rest of the world. It's going to find its way out. Right? But if you keep your heart pure, then the rest of it handles itself. The language that you use, how you use your tongue, or how you treat your fellow man, or how you treat your spouse, or your children, or your parents, or the church, or your neighbor. All those things come out of a pure heart. And Jesus' teaching starts in the heart and not with what you have done that everybody can see. Now, note on the top of page 195. The bottom of the top paragraph, about 6 lines down, says, "And it is evident that the spirit of Jesus' teaching must be obeyed and not merely the letter of his teaching." In other words, there is a spirit behind the teaching. There is a conscience to it. The heart is involved. Now, what he's going to go on to in this next paragraph is this. It's the matter of giving. All right? Did the Jews have any? That'd be a trick question. Let me phrase it this way. As a general rule, did the Jews have any discretion as to their giving? Did they have any discretion to their giving?
Well, they were told to give 10% plus free will.
All right, they were told.
Yeah, I didn't say they did it.
They were told. But what I'm saying is the instruction was very specific, wasn't it? Yeah. And now there was some discretion. For example, and this is expressly stated in the text. Well, first of all, the firstborn of every animal belonged to the Lord, no matter what it was. And even if you decided not to give it to the priest, you still had to break its neck. All right? In other words, you didn't get to keep it under any circumstance. Then, if you had flocks, what happened was they'd run, I would just say, some kind of a chute, and they'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Stop. Grab that one. That one belongs to the Lord. That was exactly how it was prescribed to be done. Every 10th one. And by the way, and here's what the Lord even said about it. Doesn't matter if it's a good one or a bad one. He just said, run them through at random, one at a time, and every 10th one belongs to the Lord. He says, but if the 10th one is maimed or in some way not in good shape, he said, you don't swap it for one that you think is in better shape. But if your conscience bothers you, you take the one that's in bad shape, number 10, you take him out, and then you take number 11 and you take him out, if number 11 is in good shape. Notice, you don't get to use your discretion to swap. The 10th one belongs to the Lord. But if it bothers your heart to give him one that's, what if one comes through here and only got 3 legs? Number 10's only got 3 legs. It belongs to the Lord. And you didn't have to swap it or add to it. The Lord was perfectly content to have it. But you could add one to it. You could take that one out and take the next one out. And there were 3 free will offerings through the course of the year for the Jews. Only 3. And even then, there was no prescribed amount. No prescribed amount. That's why it's called a free will offering. But most of the giving was done by prescription. You gather up sheaves, you drop a sheaf in the field, don't go back and pick it up. That one don't belong to you. When it comes time to gather your olives, you shake the trees one time. Whatever falls out is yours. The rest of it belongs to the stranger, the pilgrim, the poor. Everything by prescription. Right? What kind of prescription do we have in our giving today?
Just as you've been prospered.
As we've been prospered. And what?
Well, you got to.
Every man as he has been prospered, that's 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Purposed in his heart, 2 Corinthians 9, 6 and 7. Every man as he is purposed in his heart, so let him give.
Well, it also takes in there to give more than Jews in a way.
Where?
It's in there.
It ain't in there.
Well, it don't say it in those words now, but it's in there.
It ain't in there.
Sure it is.
No, it's not.
Well, if your righteousness don't exceed the scribes and
That's
Pharisees.
Matthew 5:20. That verse ain't got one thing to do with
Well,
you.
I put it that way.
I know you do, but that don't make it right.
Well, that's just the way you want to see it.
Jesus is not talking about, by the way, I used that verse to teach the same thing, Walter, years ago, but I stopped when I learned what it meant.
I still think it a little.
I understand. There ain't nothing wrong with that. Ain't nothing in the world wrong with that. But, I mean, there's a general principle that we have a better covenant established among better promises. And I would say, based on that alone, we ought to be better givers.
Yeah.
Now, that is in the book. We have a better covenant established upon better promises. We have the blood of Christ. They had the blood of animals. And so with that in mind. But I knew what you was getting at, Walter. I just yanking the chain.
You weren't going to bother me that way.
All right. Now, all right. Giving. As we've been prospered, as we've purposed in our heart, and at what interval? First day of every week. First day of every week. So the only thing that's expressly prescribed is the interval. Right? Everything else is left up to what? My heart. Everything else is left up to my heart. Now, he that soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. He that soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. Every man as he is purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly nor of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. By the way, the word, he who soweth bountifully, the word bountifully there is the Greek word eulogios, from which we get our word eulogy. Eulogy, E-U, good. U is good. Logos, word, or message. A eulogy is a good message. In our day and time, we use the eulogy to what? We say a good word over the dead, right? That's what a eulogy is. We eulogize them. We speak a good word over the dead. That's where that word comes from. But ultimately it means a good word. He who sows with a good word reaps with a good word. In other words, our giving is an expression, a visible, measurable expression of our love for God. That's what the text teaches. In other words, what I give says just about everything anyone would need to know about how much I love the Lord. That's the meaning of the word. And so it's in my heart. Look, a man that doesn't give very much doesn't appreciate what he has. Either that or he doesn't know where he got it. Doesn't know where he got it. Now, I'm not saying that a man can't be a very generous giver and still be a sinner. All right? We all know that can happen. But I don't know how a man can be chintzy with the Lord. Be chintzy with the Lord and be a faithful Christian. I just don't see it. Yeah, Kev.
You know, for years growing up, whatever, you might have heard the word or the words, give till it hurts.
Yeah.
Well, that goes against everything the Bible teaches.
That's exactly right.
Because it says not grudgingly because I've got to do it.
That's right.
Give till it feels good, being cheerful.
That's right.
God also said, be responsible with what you have, but God comes first.
That's right. God has to come first. I mean, there's no question. And so, but again, what are we talking about? We're talking about the difference of the prescription of the old law versus the new law. I mean, wouldn't it be great if God just said, all right, here it is, 10% of your gross income. 10% of your gross income every week. That'd make it easy, wouldn't it? That'd make it easy. 10% of your gross income every week. What's the problem with that? Well, it goes back to the same problem we talked about last week. I mean, there's no heart in it. There's no heart in it. Also, it tends itself back to law keeping, which was, the Jews put their their faith in their ability to what they perceived to keep the law, and they thought that made them good. And so if we had, what if it said this? What if the Bible said this? 10% of your gross income, 3 prayers, 6 songs, 30-minute sermon, all right, and the Lord's Supper. What would most churches have? They'd have exactly what was prescribed, right? They'd have exactly what was prescribed. And then they'd feel really good about themselves when they could come in and check all of those things off their list and feel good about themselves. But, well, I've kept the law of God. I'm a good person. And go out and feel good about themselves and never one time engage their heart in what was going on. Is that right?
Well, you got
It
an
is right.
example of that.
Sir?
You got an example of that. The guy stood up in his thing.
That's exactly right. The Pharisee in Luke 18, he stood up and read his checklist off of all the things that he did. And he counted himself as a righteous person, rather than the publican that said, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And so we have this example. Now, over to page 197. We have a bell yet? No? Now, 195, 196 talks about different things. Like the Lord doesn't specify. The Lord just simply says, sing with the Spirit and sing with the understanding also. He doesn't tell us how many songs. We are to observe the Lord's Supper on the first day. On the first day of every week. We're to pray with the Spirit, with the understanding also. And so,
let me say something here.
Go ahead.
About the singing. There's no place in the Bible that says carry a tune.
That's right. The Bible says nothing about carrying a tune.
And I hear people say, well, I can't sing. I can't carry that tune.
Right.
They don't say that.
Doesn't say a word about it. What's it say?
Sing.
There you go. Sing and make melody in your heart. That's what it said. That's what it said. Now, on top of page 197. On the top of page 197. And I'm just going to introduce this and we'll pick it up next week. Actually, it's the bottom of 196. The paragraph starts at bottom of 196. It says, the practice of dealing with the New Testament teaching as a law of the letter has also been encouraged by a method of teaching or a method of testing religious activities. It is the method of insisting upon a chapter and verse citation or a thus saith the Lord for everything practiced in religion. You say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, he's going to explain to us what he means by that. The method appears to be very praiseworthy. The underlying principle is unmistakably sound, and the goal that is sought, loyalty to God's authority, is certainly above question. However, a prolonged and growing emphasis upon you are commanded to do this, you are commanded not to do that, or you are not commanded to do that, without due emphasis upon the basic Bible teaching and spiritual nature of the New Testament teaching, to give a fully balanced perspective has had a narrowing and hence distorted effect upon interpretation. Now, that's a long sentence, and I'd hate to have to diagram it. But here's what he's saying. And I think that, again, anytime, just like the Bible, anytime a book is written, it has to be read in the context of the time frame in which it was written. You remember early on in this book, Stroop made a number of effects to carnal warfare. Carnal warfare. In other words, can a man be a conscientious objector? Can he fight for his country, etc. Why was that? Why did that keep coming up in this book? Well, the book was written in 1949, or published in 1949, right on the heels of World War II. Right. Now, why would a man start talking about people looking for thus saith the Lord, book, chapter, and verse, expressly stated for everything? What was going on in the church in the 30s and 40s and 50s that might have some respect to this? Anybody have any idea? Well, there were debates going on about instrumental music, but those had already started in the 20s, and that was one of the arguments that was made in regard to instrumental music is, it doesn't say not to, or you're not commanded not to. Right. Here's where I think he's going. The anti-movement. The anti-movement. No orphans' homes. No church cooperation. no benevolence out of the church treasury for anybody but Christians. No Bible classes. And that's been the essence. That's no eating in the church building. Those are the essential arguments of anti-ism. Now, where did they get these ideas? From the very thing that Stroop is talking about right here. What he's talking about is that they pervert the spirit of New Testament teaching to try to enforce their view of you don't have a thus saith the Lord. Especially in the what we call the non-saints position. Our anti-brethren do not think you can take one dime out of the church treasury to help anybody who's not a Christian. That's their position. They've debated that position. They've written on that position. It's one of the most ungodly, unchristlike positions anybody that could ever call themselves a Christian could take. Now let me tell you something. I'll show you how bad this position is. Don't ring a bell on me. You hear me? Yeah. This won't take me just a minute. It was G.K. Wallace debated a man in Athens, Alabama back in the 50s, I believe it was, on the saints, what they call saints-only benevolence. And Wallace made this statement. He asked a series of questions. And by the way, Wallace, when he debated, he always asked a series of questions, but he was trying to get to one thing. He asked the question, he said, is it all right for the church to build a preacher a house? Or to build a house for the preacher to live in? And the preacher who was on there says, well, yes. He says, well, is it all right for the church to take money out of the treasury to provide for the landscape for the preacher's house? In other words, can the church take money out of the treasury to buy shrubs and grass seed for the preacher's home and make the preacher's home look nice? He said, yes. He says, can the church take money out of the treasury and buy fertilizer for the yard of the preacher's house so that the grass will be green and everything will be kept up and looking nice? And the preacher said, yes. He says, well, see, there's your problem. He says, you think it's all right to take money out of the treasury to feed grass, but you don't think it's acceptable to take money out of the treasury to feed a person that's starving right across the street. See, that's the foolishness of that position. I'll give you another one, and this one happened to me. I was debating back and forth using email with an anti-preacher one time, and I said, well, let me ask you a question. I said, if there was a car crash out in front of the church building, right in front of the church building, and the car caught on fire, I said, could you take the garden hose and hook it up to the spigot and use the church's water to put that car out? And he didn't, and here's what he ended up saying. He said, I would do it, but then I would pay for the water bill. That's what he said. I'd take the church's water and the church's water hose and turn the water on and put the car out, but I would pay for the water bill.
But ain't you getting paid by the church?
What's that?
But ain't you getting paid by the treasury of the church?
Well, I don't know. But you want to talk about straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. But that's where Stroop is going with it, with these statements. It's not that we don't think you need a thus saith the Lord. It's just that there are principles of interpretation, and there is the spirit of the teaching of Christ that permits us to do some things without having to be expressly told to do it. All right, now you can ring it.